Life Audio.
Coming up on Encouragement for You, longtime pastor and author Dr. Erwin Luther pinpoints a core issue in today's society as he discusses his new book, The Eclipse of God.
Welcome to the Encouragement for You podcast, brought to you by Encouragement Communications in association with the Salem Web Network and is part of the Life Audio Faith Toolkit series. For more inspirational, faith-affirming podcasts, visit lifeaudio.com. In just a moment, your host, Don Hawkins, will introduce today's episode. First, a word from our sponsors. For decades, Erwin Luther served as pastor of the Historic Moody Church in Chicago and has hosted a number of Christian radio broadcasts. Recently, he joined Encouragement for You host Don Hawkins to talk about his latest book, titled The Eclipse of God.
Now, Erwin, your title, The Eclipse of God, suggests a metaphor from the world of science, one that reflects on our culture today. Talk about that.
Well, you know, when there's an eclipse, and we've experienced eclipses recently, I think we had one in April. When there's an eclipse, the sun is unaffected, but the earth is affected because the moon comes in between the sun and the earth. And there is an eclipse of God in America, definitely. God is hidden. It doesn't change God, most assuredly, but darkness settles over the land. As a matter of fact, there's a reference to it not directly as an eclipse, but the truth of it in Isaiah 59, where God says, "Your sin has caused me to hide my face from you, and when you call to me, I will not hear." That's what I call the eclipse. And the amazing thing that I want to emphasize right out of the gate, Don, is this, that the moon, of course, is 400 times smaller than the sun.
Yes.
And yet at the same time, it looks as big as the sun to us when we look at it in the sky. And the reason is, even though it's 400 times smaller, it is also 400 times closer. My point is this. Secularism, the dark night of secularism, is descending upon us, and it appears to be as big as God, but of course it isn't. God is still God. He's unaffected, and the reason that I wrote the book, The Eclipse of God, is to help people to understand the darkness, the way in which God is redefined today, but also to give people hope to live beyond the culture, to see that we are still worshiping a God who is totally unaffected and is still God, a very God.
Erwin, it seems to me that one of the very important points that you make in this book is that God has been redefined as being somewhat more tolerant than he used to be.
Oh, yes. You know, Don, one of the reasons I was motivated to write this book is that a couple of years ago, The Economist had an article in which it says, God is becoming more liberal. He's becoming as liberal as we are. After all, the Church of England, apparently, is approving of same-sex relationships. And it says nobody believes in the smighty Almighty, the God who smote the Egyptians, the God who smote Sodom and Gomorrah. Nobody believes in that God. God is more tolerant. As a matter of fact, on the online edition, the title was, "Nearer My God to Me." And what the article said is, rather than praying, "Lord, may thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven," we can reverse that and say, "May thy will be done in heaven as it is done on earth." So the point is this: Americans don't mind believing or saying that they believe in God, just as long as he is the God that they would like to believe in, the God of their consciousness. That's the God that they want to believe in. And so we have redefined God. As a matter of fact, a chapter in the book that we're talking about, The Eclipse of God, I have a chapter on the whole issue of how God is redefined, and it has to do with spirituality, where you can be spiritual, but you don't have to be religious. You don't need any specific doctrines. And so we have a God who's very tolerant. I prove it historically. There are two doctrines that destroyed the church. One is the essential goodness of man, and the other is the endless tolerance of a non-judgmental God.
So if God is non-judgmental and man is inherently good, no wonder our world is in the mess it's in right now. No question about it. I remember years ago, the president of Southeastern Bible College, when I was a student there, and that's been a lot of years ago, Erwin, Dr. Alden Gannett used to define the status quo as the mess we're in. And there's no question that we're in a mess right now. Erwin, as I recall, you had 3 reasons for writing this book, and they were tied into a number of divisions of what we might call the radical secularism of our day.
The first reason is so that we might understand the intellectual roots of the darkness, and I want to comment on that. What I do there is Nietzsche was a philosopher who died in the year 1900 in Germany, in Weimar, and he proclaimed the death of God.
Yes.
He said, "Do we not hear the noise of the grave diggers?" So what I do is I show that there are 3 grave diggers. He doesn't tell us who he had in mind, but these would be the most logical ones. Number 1, Karl Marx,
yes,
who attacked God as ruler. Number 2, very critically, Darwin, who attacked God as creator. And third, Freud, who attacked God as lawgiver. I want to just comment, let me say a word about Darwin.
Okay.
Darwin came up with the idea that we came up through the animal world. As a matter of fact, I have a quote in the book where he says that the baboon is our grandfather. Now, I want everyone who is listening to think about this. If the baboon is our grandfather, if we came up through the animal world, we are only animals, a little bit more intelligent, a little bit more along the continuum, but we are just animals. If that's the case, we have no argument against abortion, no argument against infanticide or euthanasia, because we do euthanasia with animals. You know, an animal gets sick and there's very little hope for recovery. The animal is put to sleep, as we say.
Yes.
Well, why not do that with human beings? The only reason why there is such a thing as human rights and universal human rights is because we are created in the image of God. We are different not just in degree, but we are actually different in kind. And so Darwin, a secular writer, said was the universal acid that destroyed Christianity, because now you didn't need a God to create, and you didn't need a God for human rights because, you know, we came up through the animal world. Now, while I'm on the topic, I also have another chapter in the book later on the topic of law and human rights, and I show that unless you believe in creation, there can be no human rights. And, you know, the statement in the Declaration, we believe that all men were created equal and were endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights.
Yes.
I always knew how significant that was. But recently I was in Germany. I was in Nuremberg, where the trials were held. I was in the very courtroom where the German people, the evil people, were tried. And never before have I understood with such clarity why that is so important. And the reason is because the Germans were arguing we didn't break any laws. We were consistent with the laws of Germany. Hitler had declared that killing Jews was not illegal. So the question was, on what do we base law? And as I point out in my book, Robert Jackson, an attorney, showed this, that there is a transcendent law that applies to everyone. He argued for human rights. And the only way you can do that is if you believe in creation and the biblical account.
And, of course, these days, higher education is doing everything it can to undermine the biblical account of creation, and certainly following along the path of Darwin. And you talked about Karl Marx, and in reality, to some degree, all of the secularism, the radical secularism of our day, as you point out, really grows to a great degree out of what Karl Marx put forth.
Exactly. Marx looked around and he saw oppression. He said that if you stop oppressing human beings, They are just going to turn into such nice people. We won't even need any laws. Isn't that ever a nice idea? So get rid of the oppression. But in order to get rid of it, what you have to do is you have to destroy belief in God, because you see, and the family absolutely had to be destroyed. Because in Marx's view, the family was a unit of oppression. Men oppressed their wives, parents oppressed their children. They took them to God, to church. God is the ultimate oppressor. So obviously God has to be destroyed. The family has to be destroyed. Everybody has to be equal. He believed in open borders, which meant that everyone became a citizen of the world. And so everyone was supposed to live happily. But of course, we know that wasn't so. We know some of the evils that communism has brought about, far worse than we can even discuss. And the point to be made is, as America increasingly grows towards socialism, a form of cultural Marxism, the cultural Marxists say that we have to make America Marxist, but we're going to do it incrementally, so we don't need a revolution, so that people see its beauty. Well, where does that lead? And then we've talked about Darwin. Freud, he believed in the pleasure principle, and the highest pleasure was sexuality. So to him, all prohibitions regarding sex, especially as found in the scriptures, have to be destroyed. And when you have sexual freedom, everyone is going to live in happiness.
And he
that hasn't worked out very
no,
well.
Not at all. In fact, he even included not only a lot of the sexual perversion that we're seeing dominating our society today, he would even go so far as to say pedophilia and that kind of thing, correct?
Yeah. He opened the door for that. Now here's the thing. A few moments ago, I mentioned Nietzsche, who said that God was dead.
Yes.
Nietzsche actually had, in one of his books, someone go through the cathedrals of Europe and proclaim that they are tombs of God. Now remember, this was in the late 1800s. Go to Europe today. If you go to Bedford, England, where Bunyan was, that cathedral is now a nightclub. The cathedrals throughout Europe, many of them are restaurants, libraries, many of them are mosques. And what Nietzsche predicted came to pass. Now, I want everyone who's listening to ask this question to themselves. Maybe they already have. Where was the church? Why was the church not able to withstand these hammer blows? And in my book, I discuss various things, but a couple of things very quickly. Number one, the church had already been weakened because the core of Christianity had been cut out. Now, isn't this interesting? We must realize that ideas have consequences and bad ideas have victims.
Yes.
There was a Christian teacher, a philosopher, a theologian called Schleiermacher. You know for sure with a name like that he's German.
I remember studying about him. He was one of the rascals.
He defined religion as a feeling of absolute dependence. Now, everyone should take a deep breath and ask, what does that mean? Think of what that means for us today. What you have is truth being moved from objectivity to subjectivity. If you ask the question, why did the LGBTQ plus make so many gains, it would be because of compassion, because of feeling. To be compassionate is very good, but compassion for the wrong thing can also lead us down the wrong path. So today, the whole emphasis is on how do I feel? What is my truth? What is your truth? And so truth has lost its objectivity.
We'll be back with more after a brief word from our sponsors. And don't forget to listen for Don's live weekend talk show, Encouragement Live, heard Saturdays at 7:05 p.m. Central Time on American Family Radio and other radio stations around the country, as well as on the worshipchannel.org. Now, let's rejoin Dr. Erwin Luther and Encouragement for You host Don Hawkins for part 2 of the discussion on the Eclipse of God.
Erwin, you have shared with us a lot of very significant content about the cultural decline, the eclipse of God, the redefining of God, and where it came from in Europe and how it's come to this country. But I know you have some encouragement for us, specifically encouragement to the church to take a stand on some of these things.
Yes, and, the context in which I'm giving this is you had asked me the 3 purposes of the book.
Yes.
The Eclipse of God. I mentioned the intellectual roots and the darkness. But secondly, to encourage believers to remember that God is sovereign. In Isaiah chapter 6, that very familiar passage of Scripture, in the year that King Uzziah died, I saw also the Lord. Isn't that significant?
Yes.
Uzziah was a king who reigned, I think, for 52 years. He was a good king. He ended somewhat badly, but he was a good king. And now the throne of Israel was empty. What was God saying to the prophet? God was saying this: the throne on earth may be empty, but the throne in heaven is well occupied. And, we look about us and we see all the political unrest. We see racial unrest. We look at the internet with all of the accusations and counter-accusations. Everyone seems to be angry about something. People are being vilified, sometimes very untruthfully, that is to say, deliberately.
Yes.
And it's a very time of great transformation. This is not the America that you and I knew even 20 years ago.
Oh, yes.
But the point is this: the throne in heaven is well occupied. It says in the Psalms that God has established his throne. Well, who established it? Well, God has established his own throne. So what I encourage people to do is look beyond the headlines. We are being bombarded with headlines these days, particularly in this election year. Look beyond them and recognize that God is still God, that even in the eclipse of God, God still remains God. He still is faithful to his people. His promises can be believed. And I would say that one of the greatest challenges is for all of us to live with eternal values in a very fleeting world. So everyone out there, ask yourself this question: what does faithfulness look like to me? And everyone is going to answer that question differently. A housewife is going to answer that differently than perhaps a businessman who's in a certain situation. But ask yourself that question, and then make sure that before you go to your phone in the morning, go to the Bible first, focus on God, commit your way to the Lord, seek him for wisdom, seek him for guidance, trust him, and just know that no matter how bad the storm is, God is there. As a matter of fact, there's something that comes to mind, Don, that I have to tell people.
Okay.
When I was in Germany recently leading a tour, I told the people about Dietrich Bonhoeffer just before Hitler became the chancellor and so forth. But Germany was in turmoil. I mean, there were riots, there were food shortages. And Bonhoeffer preached a message about Jesus being in the boat, Mark chapter 4. And he said that when Jesus got into the boat, and Jesus was in the boat in that story, sleeping, Jesus was with them in the boat. And what you and I need to do is to recognize that in our storm, if you're a believer, Jesus is in your boat.
Oh, yes.
And so be encouraged, and just know that people have been through storms before, and God has been there for them.
That subject, Erwin, brings up something that you make as a very important point, and it goes right along with the fact that Jesus was in the boat. But there was also a storm on the outside of the boat. And one of the points that you make is that this issue is not a political war. It's not just a culture war. That undergirding all of this is a spiritual war that goes all the way back to Satan's original rebellion against God.
And, we're living at a time of irrationality. And so one of the things I do in the book is to argue that we can't think that we can win this war just by having superior ideas. People are being told, in effect, that 2 + 2 is 5. Men can have babies. And, the West is evil, and other countries are better than America, which isn't true at all, by the way. If you've ever traveled to Albania, where I was recently on a preaching tour, or other countries, you soon learn the uniqueness of America. But all that we do is complain. And the point to be made is this, that God has led us to this moment, and he's going to see us through this moment. And what we need to do is to realize that we have an agenda, but we have to call on God. Only God can rescue us. I'm thinking of Jehoshaphat in 2 Chronicles chapter 20, where he says, as the armies were coming, Lord, we don't know what to do, but our eyes are on you.
Love that passage, yes.
That's the third point in my book, yeah. And that is this, that only a humble, repentant church is able to stand against the darkness. The darkness is so overwhelming. I've written about how propaganda works, and I have done that because I'm very interested in how cultural streams work. The cultural streams are pounding against us. And we recognize that there are changes being made with long-term implications. What we need to do is to stand against the culture, but we have to stand on our knees, so to speak, in repentance and faith before God, because this is a spiritual battle. Behind all of it, as Paul says, we don't wrestle with flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers. And so, in a sense, I also want my book to be a call to prayer, a call to repentance. And every chapter of the book, The Eclipse of God, that we're talking about, every chapter ends with a declaration of dependence and an action step.
Yes.
What do I do in light of what this chapter has to say?
And it seems to me those two specifics at the end of each chapter, as I've been reading the book, I felt like you really nail those, the issue of dependence. You sort of bring the lesson of the chapter home, and then you include the action step. And a lot of those action steps, as you've mentioned, are steps that we take on our knees. But some of those involve the steps of shining as lights in the darkness. I think about the words that Jesus shared in the gospel, let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. We, to a great degree, as a church, have not accomplished that purpose. And you point out in the book that that's one of the reasons why in this country, as well as in Europe, the darkness has become so rampant.
And, I don't write my books necessarily on how to reclaim the culture, but how to reclaim the church.
Yes.
And we as a church need to walk that fine line between truth and love, of course. But it is best to tell the truth, even if you're considered to be a hater, than it is to tell a lie with sweet, caring tones.
Well put.
And one of the points that I make in terms of action steps is this. Let's talk about the whole gender affirming care that we have in our society today. Children are being destroyed.
Yes.
Young people are confused. We have to also, in addition to standing against this darkness, we have to be a safety net for people, because there are many who are going to be going through and already are going through deep regret, deep hurt. They've been told a lie, and they're living with the consequences of that lie. And it's wonderful when Christians come along with the culture, that is, to walk along with people who are broken, to point them to Christ, to love them, to give them a sense of hope, a sense of dignity, because we are not only a broken culture, but we have a culture that wants to break us. That is to say, break us in the worst possible way.
Yes.
And the church needs to stand against this. And parents need instruction as to what to say. If your child comes and says he is trans, I deal with that even in the book. how do you handle that? You handle it Christianly, but you also handle it with truth. And these are the things that we have to learn that we've not had to learn before.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Encouragement for You with Don Hawkins, host of Encouragement Live Radio and author of over 25 books, including Never Give Up and Master Discipleship Today. You can find more about Don and his books at encouragementlive.org. Encouragement for You is a production of Encouragement Communications with the Salem Web Network and lifeaudio.com. Editing by Phil Giebers, production by Elizabeth Andrade. If you enjoyed what you heard today, we'd love for you to head over to your favorite podcast app and leave us a review. It really does help people find us.
Let me take just a second to thank the team at Life Audio for their partnership with us on Encouragement for You. If you go to lifeaudio.com, you'll find dozens of other faith-centered podcasts in their network. They've got shows about prayer, Bible study, parenting, and more.
Stay encouraged and join us next time for Encouragement for You.